My name is Neela Ghoshal, and I'm the Director of Law and Policy at Outright. And I'm thrilled to be here for the first session of Out Summit 2021. We're kicking off the summit this year with a session on LGBTIQ lives in crisis, surviving political and natural disasters. So I've just heard my colleague Maria introduce Out Summit by talking about both challenges and successes in the recent months, crises and opportunities in our movement. This has been a big year for both. And this session is going to look at some hotspots around the world that have been marked by crisis that has impacted the lives of LGBTIQ people this year. And we want to look at how a political crisis or a natural disaster specifically affects LGBTIQ lives, but not just focus on the negative aspects of that. We also want to think about how activists and advocates can best support the needs of LGBTIQ people during crisis. I have some incredible panelists with me today who are going to speak about 4 global contexts that are illustrative of the different types of crises that LGBTIQ people are facing at the moment. These are Poland, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Haiti. Our panelists will discuss how LGBTIQ people and advocates have had to adapt to challenging circumstances in these 4 countries in order to continue their activism or just to find basic safety and security. We're going to speak about what lessons can be learned so that LGBTIQ communities in other countries can better prepare for a political crisis or a natural disaster, and how stakeholders, including the international community, can be prepared to quickly pivot in order to better support LGBTIQ lives at a time of crisis. Our panelists are, first we have Milosz Przepiórkowski. He's a board member at Lambda Warsaw, where he's the coordinator of a group dedicated to bi+ people. He coordinates the volunteer program, and he also organizes cultural events, including the LGBT Film Festival. Milosz will be speaking about the politically manufactured crisis affecting LGBTIQ people in Poland, where an increasingly authoritarian government has sought to scapegoat our communities, and where Parliament recently debated a proposal to ban pride parades and other public gatherings deemed to promote same-sex relationships. Aza Sultan is the Middle East and North Africa Regional Program Advisor at Outright Action International. She's from Sudan and based in Washington, D.C., and is the co-founder of several prominent LGBTIQ organizations in the MENA region, including Badaya, Mesahat Foundation for Sexual and Gender Diversity, the Queer Women Network, and the North Africa Center for Strategic Partnerships. Aza has been working closely with Sudanese LGBTIQ organizations and is going to speak about the crisis brought on by an October 2021 military coup, which brought a halt to growing momentum in support of greater respect for LGBTIQ people's human rights. Lester Feder is Outright's Senior Fellow for Emergency Research. He's a journalist and photographer who has reported in more than 40 countries. He was BuzzFeed News' first international correspondent, pioneering a first-of-its-kind LGBTIQ rights international beat, and he was named the National Lesbian and Gay Journalist Association's Journalist of the Year in 2015. Lester has been conducting research for how the crisis brought about by the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan in 2021 August has endangered LGBTIQ lives. And finally, Dominique Saintville is founding member and general coordinator of the Organisation Trans d'Haïti, TRA, which promotes the recognition, visibility, and development of trans people in Haiti. Dominique leads OTRA's advocacy, collaboration, and civic education initiatives, working with trans communities to ensure their effective civic participation and to lay the foundations for a fair and inclusive Haitian society. He will discuss how ongoing discrimination means that LGBTIQ people are disproportionately impacted by crisis when it comes in the form of a natural disaster, such as Haiti's August 2021 earthquake. So let's get started by turning over to Milosz. Milosz, please go ahead and kick us off by telling us about what's going on in Poland and how LGBTIQ people have been impacted. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Miłosz. I'm from Poland, from Warsaw. I wanted to tell you firstly about the political situation, that the parliament has recently debated a law that would ban prides and pride marches throughout Poland. If this law came through, we would have a situation exactly the same as it is in Russia. So all the prides and the showing off with the rainbow flag would be illegal. For now, this law has been put in the so-called freezer, so it is not being debated right now. But we as activists are aware that whenever there is a scapegoat needed, this law will be taken out into debate. Right now we have the refugee crisis, so LGBT people are not that much impacted at the moment because we have the crisis at the border with Belarus. So the government is scaring Polish people with the immigrants that would come to Poland and, destroy the traditional Polish family and so on. Horrible hate speech, for now focused on refugees. This situation for us is very dramatical regarding refugees and LGBT because it's a permanent change between one group and the other. Whenever the government needs to scare people, they either use refugees or LGBT people. So these are the two levels how the government is, controlling the whole situation when it comes to have an enemy. The second thing is that the hate speech against the LGBTQIAP community has been present since 2015, strongly, since we have the current government, the far-right government. As I said before, in 2015, the situation started with the refugee crisis in Europe, in the European Union, and the refugees were used as an example to scare people, to tell them, if you don't vote for us, the other party will let the refugees in. So they won. Finally, nothing happened in other European countries when it comes to refugees. So they needed a new scapegoat to scare people with. So they chose us, the LGBTQIAP community. This has been really, really strong since last year, spring, when it came to the presidential debate, because we were voting for a new president for the next 5 years. And we have been dehumanized by the candidate, the previous president, who got unfortunately re-elected. He said that LGBT, these are not people, this is an ideology. We need to fight this ideology because it will eventually destroy the traditional Polish family. So that was the rhetoric that we were, hearing all the time. Obviously, we were trying to do as organizations something with it, but we are not funded by the government, obviously. In order to have bigger campaigns, awareness campaigns, and to show people that we are human beings and we are normal and we just want to live our life, money is needed, which there was a lack of. So we couldn't do much. We were doing things on internet basis and Facebook, Instagram, and so on. Of course, we were writing to the European Parliament. Some actions have been taken, in our opinion, not enough. But we will see for the future when it comes to funding, and hopefully it will be connected to LGBT rights and to the whole situation. The last thing that I wanted to tell you about is our 2-year report that has been released yesterday. It's a report on the LGBTQIAP community in Poland, and the numbers are alarming because the report shows, it has been prepared in cooperation with the University of Warsaw, and it shows that 98%, have faced microaggression in the last 2 years, in 2019 and 2020. 68% have faced violence, 22% sexual violence. 17% of people, mostly young people from the community, have faced the trauma of homelessness. The only good news about the report is it's a paradox. It's the COVID situation where the number of violence that the LGBT community has experienced was less than in the previous years because people were mostly stuck at home. Of course, there was violence at home from the family, sometimes from the partner, but it was less than in the previous years. We as Lambda are running the shelter for people who have faced the trauma of homelessness within so people from the LGBTQIAP community. And this situation is really traumatic for us because we have mostly, the average age is 19. We have 12 people in our shelter. Those are people who are very often kicked out of their homes right on their 18th birthday. So basically it was a birthday present for them. So I gave birth to a son and not a daughter. I wanted grandchildren. You are not my child because you are not straight. You will never have a normal family out. So this is the thing that we are doing. We are running the shelter. Some other cities in Poland are doing it as well. And this is highly needed because the situation, as I said, is getting worse and worse, especially when we look at the numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Milos. It's very disturbing to hear how the government need to construct an enemy somewhere within society has led to this targeting of LGBTIQ people that even results in children essentially being kicked out of their own homes. And we know that the government bears responsibility for this. We're going to turn over to Azza to speak with us about Sudan. Go ahead, Azza. And I'm sorry, Azza, just before you start, I see that a couple people are already using the Q&A. Please feel free, participants, as our panelists speak, to put questions in the Q&A, and we'll get to them later on in the session. Thank you. And Azza, sorry for the interruption. Please go ahead.
No, I'm just going to share slides here with everybody. I hope you're seeing my screen. Okay, so good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is Azza Sultan. I am the Middle East and North Africa program advisor at Outright. I go by she, her. And today I'm just going to give you a historical background about Sudan and the current situation of the LGBTQI people. So for those who don't know much about Sudan, Sudan is a country located in the Northeast Africa, and that location make it a mix between its African and Arab surrounding. And that's also made the country multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious, but with a clear dominance and of the Arab Islamic component of this mix. The history of Sudan often and always characterized by political instabilities, civil wars and conflict, specifically in South Sudan and in the West and in the Darfur region. And Sudan has witnessed different colonial eras. Sudan was colonized by the Ottoman Empire, by the British, by the Egyptians. And since its independence in 1956, Sudan has been ruled by a series of unstable civilian governments, short and then long military regime. And this, what we call the evil circle or vicious cycle, has always been going on, and always the military regime has been thrown by different revolutions. The first revolutions happened in 1964 against a military general called Ibrahim Aboud, who was the president of Sudan in the period between 1958 to 1964. And then the second revolution happened in 1985 against also a military general called Mohammed Jafar Numeri, who was the president of Sudan in the period between 1969 to 1985. And the significant things about Jafar Numeri, he is the one that's introduced Islamic laws in Sudan in 1983, which is called Sharia laws, and that's we're going to see that has a huge impact in the criminalization of homosexuality in Sudan. The third revolution started in December 2018 against more than 30 years of long military dictatorship led by President Omar al-Bashir and the Muslim Brothers regime. So it was a combination of a military rule, but also Islamic rule. And that regime was accused of human rights abuses, including torture, ethnic genocide, and persecution against minorities such as women and LGBTQI people. And so we can see that since the 1983, Islam was a state religion, and all the Islamic laws was applied since that time. Until in 2020, after the revolution, Sudan was declared a secular state. I mean, that's still in the paper because in the legal judicial system, the courts is still going by Sharia laws and Islamic laws. Sudan is a member of so many bodies like United Nations, Arab League, African Union, and also Sudan is a signatory of many international treaties, but yet the human rights violation, the record of the human rights violation in Sudan is very huge. And the experience of the human rights abuses in Sudan is manifested through three mechanisms. If we look at it from that perspective, it's the absence of safeguard or protection, it's the intentional restriction or repression by the virtue of the legal provision and the practice. And if we look at the legal and the societal context, we find that the same-sex activities between adults are considered illegal in Sudan. And societal discrimination against the LGBTQI people are widespread still in the country. So basically, there is laws in the Penal Code of Sudan called sodomy laws, Article 148. Among other laws that has been known as a public order, these laws apply to prostitution, indecency in public places, and so on. So historically, these laws has been used against the community in Sudan. The good news is last year in July 2020, the government passed a package of amendments to the existing laws, and this legal reform included change to the Article 148 and abolished the death penalty and flogging for same-sex activities, but unfortunately it added imprisonment for up to 7 years, which was 5 years before this legal reform. And regardless of the implementation of this so-called sodomy laws, I mean, the mere existence of these laws is a threat to the community members. So in December, as I said, in December 2018, a major political shift in the power took place. Protesters went on the street and they brought down the previous regime. And in the past, like 2 months ago, in the past, in September, a tension appeared between in the surface between the government, military and civilian side leaders, which has led to arrest of so many civilian leaders, including the prime minister who was placed under house arrest. and complete shutdown of communications and internet. And in the past few weeks, actually, the military killed hundreds of Sudanese people who have massively taken the streets to defend their revolution. So this is political instability and chaos in the country had repercussions on the LGBTQI activists and community members, and led actually some of them to temporarily seek refuge in other neighboring countries, fearing for their life and safety. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Azza. And I see there's somebody raising their hand. Kim, I see you. Please put your question in the chat and we'll get to you at the end of the panel. If it's a tech issue, please put the tech issue in the chat and our tech support people will help you out there. Thank you so much, Azza. I mean, it's clear from your presentation that our lives are so dependent on political circumstances, and we think we're making progress, and then the progress can be so quickly cut short. And so these are the kinds of things we need to think about in terms of strategizing for how our movements can have longevity, even in the face of crisis. We're going to turn over to Lester Feder now, our senior emergencies researcher, who's been working on how people in Afghanistan have been affected by the Taliban takeover. Lester, please go ahead.
Thanks, Neela, and thanks to all the other panelists. It's been really interesting to hear about the situations in your countries. I want to start by just telling a story of one person who I spoke to this fall from Afghanistan. And this is a woman who had been living with her family before the American withdrawal this summer. And she was discovered with her partner by one of her family members. There was a huge controversy within her family. Some of the family members wanted her killed. The solution that her parents ultimately came to the internal scandal was to force her to be married. This was the position they'd come to at the time of the American withdrawal. There were members of her family who still thought she should be killed. The parents were refusing, and before the American withdrawal, she felt reasonably protected. The police were there. She felt that they couldn't just come kill her. After the American withdrawal, some of her relatives joined the Taliban and returned demanding that she be killed. At that point, the parents accelerated the timeline for her wedding, forced her to go through with it, and then sent her and her husband off to another country under the pretense that it would be easier for the husband to find work. While there, one of her cousins actually followed to the same country, outed her to her husband, and after that was being kept prisoner by him and beaten daily. I start with this story for a couple reasons. The first is just to make clear that the problems for LGBT people didn't begin with the US withdrawal and the return of the Taliban, but Afghanistan was never a very safe place. These kinds of stories about family abuse are very, very common. We've also heard a lot of stories about sexual assault, beatings, extorted and forced sex by police officers. These are widespread issues in Afghanistan for a very long time. And even under the US-backed government, homosexuality was criminalized. This story highlights for me a number of things about the current situation. The first is, I think there's a common narrative out there that one solution, or maybe the only solution for the situation of LGBT people since the Taliban's return, is to help them flee. And the reality for a lot of people is that that's just not possible. The situation for women and gender nonconforming people is particularly bad. The Taliban enforces rules that prohibit women from traveling without a male relative. Trying to go through checkpoints, or even to go to the passport office, or to get other official documents that you might need to travel for gender nonconforming people can just be impossible because they are routinely stopped at checkpoints. Their identity documents may not match their gender presentation, and that can be enormously dangerous. I think it's also worth highlighting in this situation that family members often are turning on family members, not only because of issues of shame, but and vendettas, but also because there's a fear for their own safety if they do not report on their LGBT relatives. I think those are most of the key points about this story. And I think that we all know right now that the situation in Afghanistan is incredibly bad. As far as I'm aware, and if others can think of examples, please correct me, but this situation feels unprecedented to me, of a country of this size, of an organization that, or a regime that is explicitly declared its intention to go after LGBT people, and that there's nowhere in the region where there is safe harbor. If you look at Afghanistan on a map, most of its neighbors also criminalize homosexuality, including places that provide for the death penalty. At least in the case of Syria and Iraq, Turkey offered relative safe harbor. But there's nowhere to go, even if you can get out of the country. The neighbors are making that very difficult. And at this point, for the people who have gone into exile, they're either on short-term visas or in other countries illegally, or in countries where they're not safe. They're hoping for resettlement to Western nations that can be safer. But at this point, only a handful of LGBT Afghans specifically have been resettled. And there's no setup in most cases for people to directly get visas to the West from inside of Afghanistan. So there's a requirement that they must leave the country in some way before they're able to apply for resettlement. So I think I'll stop there and wait for your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Lester. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind in any crisis impacting LGBTIQ people. There's often a kind of gut instinct that people need to get out. And of course, it's so crucial that we do have those organizations that are providing support to people who need to flee. But we also need to figure out how to get support to people in country, and in the kind of context that we're talking about. That support can sometimes be really hard to come by, and we need to put together our collective brain power to figure out how to do it. Our next panelist is Dominique Saintville. Dominique, are you able to put on your video? Fantastic. Welcome. Dominique Saintville from Otra in Haiti. And I believe Dominique has a slideshow to share with us. Can you go ahead and share your screen? Oh, beautiful. Okay, fantastic.
First of all, I would like to say thank you to everybody that is here, and I would like to thank Outright for the opportunity that they gave me. And as stated before, I am from Haiti and representing OTRA, which is Organisation Trans d'Haïti, and I'm very proud and very happy to participate with you. You can start the slideshow now. Thank you. Yes. First, I would like to introduce the organization. The description of OTRA. OTRA is an apolitical and non-governmental organization with an association character, whose main objective is to give an inclusive and concrete representation of the Haitian trans-identitary population. OTRA's main objective is also to fight against all forms of discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. We solely work with trans persons, transgender and transsexual people for their integral development, respect for their rights and legal recognition. They're effective. We want them to be effective citizens, and they have their participation in order to lay the foundation for a fair, united and inclusive Haitian society. With regard of the SDG Sustainable Development Objective, and also in relation to the commitment of the state through the signed, ratified, and published convention and treaties of the UN and OAS institutions. Next. OTRA's mission. The fight for equal rights and obligation is one of the most important things for the institution of OTRA. An obligation between people, especially trans persons. We want to also fight against all violence, exclusion, and discrimination based on gender identity or sexual orientation. We also try to prevent to make prevention of health risks such as infection with HIV and other sexual transmitted infection. We want to promote the recognition and visibility and development of trans persons or any other people questioning their gender identity or their gender identity or sexual orientation, to set up a network of mutual aid, education and action. A solution to the isolation of trans person with regard of the SGDs. Next slide, please. Legal status. So far, if many of you have heard of Haiti, it is very difficult to get registered and have a legal representation of the institution. So far in the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labors, we are still ongoing our legal registration. And we are trying to also try to register with the Directorate of General Taxes, DGI in Haiti. We do not have indication like national security number for this association or any other account. So therefore, if we want to put action on the ground, we have to have allies, which means very big allies, people that are very involved in the work that we are doing and that are already legal. Next slide, please. How does a political crisis or disaster or natural disaster impacted on people's life, especially the LGBTIQ community, and how those activists and advocates can do their best to meet the needs of the population during this crisis. We already know that Haiti is a country where the situation is very difficult, but the situation is even more difficult after catastrophes such as earthquakes. Next slide, please. The circumstances of the earthquake from the 14th of June 2001, we want to know how that has affected the life of these people and how transgender person or victims of the earthquake have been affected generally when it comes to situations like discrimination, stigmatization, and other situations. The situation of transgender people living with HIV and AIDS has worsened, and they are in desperate needs of health needs, especially when it comes to basic health needs such as assistance, and especially when speaking about how they have to overcome the difficulties of living in a society where they are rejected. We know that so far the cases of gender-based violence has doubled, and the cases of suicide within the trans community has also increases. Next slide, please. I've taken the time to include a few pictures, and this is a picture of one of my fellow associates. We went to visit them in the South, and these are a few of the transgender that we have encountered. Next slide, please. The situations of transgender people living with HIV and AIDS. Many HIV positive transgender people have disappeared from the radar of the health institution. The ones that are responsible to keep the ones that are responsible, and they are supposed to be taking their treatment or taking care of the transgender person. As many as realized, they have left the country and they have stopped taking their medication. And in fact, they are traumatized and are feeling ashamed, which is a big problem for us because we cannot tend to their needs if we can't find them. Next slide, please. Again, this is a picture of my fellow associate with a few transgender. Too bad we could not take the home completely, but they are living in the streets under circumstances that are very difficult. Next slide, please. When we speak about desperate health situations, especially when it comes to basic health needs, Since before the earthquake, it was very difficult to give adequate health care to the trans community. And speaking of that, which mean assistance in mental health issues or any health issues at all, because they don't have insurance and they don't have the means to go to hospitals, private or government hospital. After the earthquake, it is not only difficult, but impossible to see to their medical needs. In the South, many from the general population had harmed them when they went to get care, and there is still no way till now to get around that issue. Next slide, please. Again, this is a picture of them. Next slide, please. The number of trans immigrants has doubled since the earthquake. Many trans people are leaving the country willingly but not legally. They mostly go to Dominican Republic, Chile, or Brazil, or any other country where there is more acceptance of the trans people. That migration has brought a lot to think about, especially when many testimonies have shown that most time they are victims of rape or abuse from the representative of the government, either from their own country or from the country where they are going to live. Next slide, please. Cases of gender-based violence has doubled. The case of suicide within the trans community has increased also. Since the earthquake, we have noticed many cases of mental health issue. So far, a few had come to end with suicidal. Many from the suicide persons are HIV positive transgender people from age of 20 to 50. Next slide, please. This transgender woman, she has been harmed and we had to take her to the hospital. This is after the hospital. We take her home and she had to show us where she is living. She's living with a young man, which is a spouse. They try to get married, but the population has really started to harm them. So they had to hide. Next slide, please. This is all. This is the professional information about UTRA and my information if anybody wants to contact. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Dominique. It's so disturbing and compelling to see the ways in which people have been affected and how even cases of suicide are on the increase. And I'm just thinking, hearing all these presentations, that although this isn't a panel about displacement, there's a thread of displacement that runs through what everyone has been discussing. Dominique and Milos have been discussing people who've been made homeless, either because of natural disasters in the case of Haiti or because of political disasters in the case of Poland, and who don't have the support networks unless civil society steps in to provide them. Lester and Aza have talked about cases in which people have also become displaced, queer people throughout Afghanistan who have fled either within the country or who have left the country altogether or have gone underground. And in the case of Sudan as well, there are a number of people who feel that they're at risk and have had to flee or go underground. And so clearly flight is a circumstance that we're dealing with in so many places and on so many levels. I wanted to kick off the discussion, and I encourage everybody to place questions in the Q&A. Please feel free to direct your questions to any particular panelist or to all of the panelists, to whoever wants to answer the question. And of course, you're also welcome to continue placing comments in the chat. But I wanted to start with a question that I'll throw out to all the panelists and see if anybody wants to jump in, which is that in the country that you're from or that you're working on, if you had known what you know now before the crisis started, that it was going to play out in this particular way, what do you think could have been done differently to better support the needs of LGBTIQ people? And I'm just going to let anybody who feels like it unmute themselves and answer the question or give some thoughts.
Just gonna jump in.
Aza, you go ahead.
Thank you, Lester. So I mean, the situation in the LGBTQI situation in Sudan seems very complicated, and I mean, since the independence of Sudan, the military dictatorship that was taking over, the implementation of the Islamic laws known as Sharia laws that's affected the LGBTQI rights in the country, and the fact that until last year, Sudan was one of the countries that has the death penalty. It's, the life of the LGBTQI people and the activists and the organizations working on the ground has been a continuous situation of security and safety threats. And I think that's as bad as it is, or as bad as it sounds, that's made the people who are working in the queer and trans movement in the country be vigilant all the time, put their they put out there some security plans, security protocols. They're always ready for this kind of situations. And they were always looking, forward for the future. For example, after the revolution in December 1920, 3 organizations working on the ground, a Bidaya organization, Misahat Foundation, and another organization called Shades of Ebony, they formed an alliance called Sudan Suji Alliance. The alliance mainly wanted to work in the advocacy effort to push for more spaces and protection for LGBTQI rights. And the coalition actually managed to submit the first LGBTQI shadow report for the Human Council in the UN. I think these examples tell us that even in the crisis, even when the situation is very hard, LGBTQI activists, they're trying to be creative and trying to be resilient and come up with plans. And I think that's the mobilization of resources and building alliances and partnerships with civil society organization and advocating in the national and regional and international level are both tactical and strategic in the long run to the protection of the LGBTQI community members. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Azza. Lester, did you want to jump in on that question as well?
Sure. I would say, I think Afghanistan is a particularly difficult example because we're talking about a place where there was basically no civil society for LGBT people. And at least as far as I'm aware, there weren't even allied organizations or general human rights organizations that were comfortable working on LGBT issues at all. So that direct preparation within the community would have been enormously difficult. I think that certainly there are a lot of recommendations that can be made from a migration standpoint, right? Like, first of all, there should have been thought before the withdrawal about what would happen to vulnerable people, and this is not an LGBT specific issue, but we know that troop contributing nations were totally overwhelmed with a number of requests for evacuations. It was the call for people to identify themselves for evacuation was sort of put out there just widely. So people were signing up on all sorts of lists, and that was creating new security challenges because those lists were not secure. So like a lot more thought and manpower should have been devoted in that space. I think that there probably was work that could have been done over the past 20 years that might have put some of this on a somewhat better situation, though I don't know that it would have been revolutionary. One was just more work might have been done with governmental or international institutions that had a presence. I'm thinking particularly of UN mechanisms. And also mainstream aid organizations, not even human rights organizations, but relief organizations, to try to sensitize them to LGBT concerns so that when something like this did happen, that might be a vehicle for some intervention. I think there's also worth a lot of thought around the tech companies. We know that a lot of vulnerabilities are coming through people's cell phones, either because there are apps that are being infiltrated or group messaging platforms. People are being threatened through their cell phones when their numbers or accounts are leaked. People are having their cell phones circulated at checkpoints. I imagine a lot could be done by tech platforms, at least on the level of providing language competent security like information about how to secure their devices, their accounts, how to delete apps, how to hide apps. And I think that would at least provide one more vehicle that would add at least a little bit of a Band-Aid on a very terrible situation.
Milos, did you want to jump in and discuss how?
Yes, I wanted to show you the Central European perspective, where, as in a democratic country, if you asked me that question last year, I would say, if something like this happens, go out, march, fight for your rights. We had this example last year where we had the so-called Women's March, which I prefer to call the March for the Abortion Rights, because it doesn't only concern women, as we know. During one march, there were 1 million people in the center of Warsaw. The effect was zero. After 1 year, we see the situation is even worse. They want to make the abortion rights even, the abortion even less accessible now, even for rape victims that will have to give birth to you know, it's crazy. So right now, I would say, whenever you have the possibility to vote, because democracy is not given once forever, but you have to fight for it. And if you have the option to fight for it through voting, I think it's the only solution right now. I hope that we will have a legal election in 2 years, and hopefully the situation will change. So for now, I would just say vote. That's from my perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Milos. And Dominique, in the case of Haiti, what do you think could have been done before the earthquake to better prepare for the needs of trans and other vulnerable communities?
From my perspective, as a nation person, citizen living in a country that is very difficult, I would say that the first responders are usually the person in country. And my only advice would be to better equip the OSCs that are in place. And it's not only an LGBTIQ issue. It is an issue that affected a lot of people, and many of them, they might not know now, but they have many families that are LGBTIQ persons. So in situation like this, people tend to not love each other, but to help each other, no matter how, what the difference is between them. So I think that having better equipped institution on the ground would be a better way to really change the situation when it comes to difficulties like that.
Yeah, we know that even a government that's not one of the most extreme in terms of its hostility to LGBTIQ people is not necessarily going to have our lives at the forefront of their agendas when there's a situation like this kind of crisis. And of course, I'm also thinking about the climate crisis, not exactly the same issue as the earthquake that happened in Haiti, but we can imagine that there are going to be many more natural disasters in the coming years affecting our communities, and that governments won't have our needs at the forefront. And so it's very important to equip civil society to respond. I want to move to some of the questions that are in the chat, and I'm going to start with a question that is directed to Milos. This question comes from Sean Cartwright, who's asking, do you have any data or high-level information on LGBTIQ+ refugees in Poland or the EU, those living at the intersection of these targeted identities?
Actually, I do, but I have numbers from 2016. I couldn't find them. There is no a newer report. Probably they are done every 5 years. It's a report from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. When it comes to Poland in 2016, when it comes to people from the LGBTQIAP community who were seeking asylum in Poland due to being LGBT, these were 3 people. Because Poland obviously is not the first choice country for LGBT people to seek help. I can give you just a few numbers because I know that we don't have so much time. In Germany, there were 56, in Finland, about 500 people. The Netherlands, between 100 and 1,000. So you see the numbers are not detailed because different organizations are taking care of these people. So these are just estimations. In Poland, to answer your questions, these were only 3.
Thanks, Milos. And we know, of course, from working in other refugee situations that sometimes when people flee because of a crisis and not specifically because of their LGBTQI identity, they don't immediately come out, certainly. And so it may take years for people to be recognized as LGBTQI refugees. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. What are the best practices to encourage fellow LGBTQ plus people to join and participate in alliances and organizations, especially if they prioritize just trying to stay alive under a political and healthcare crisis? I wondered if maybe I could direct that question to Dominique to begin with. If you have strategies for how you've encouraged people to stay active in organizations despite the desperate circumstances.
The strategies are not that much something like we can say that, how can I explain that? It's not rules, like it's not something that you can say that this is how it goes. I think one of the most thing that we can really count on, it's again the activists, the person, the advocates that are in country. It's their way of being engaged to what is going on, the way that they show support, the way that they participate. This encourage other people to get involved. And that's what happened for me, because I was not an activist. I was 20 something, I wasn't an activist till I met Charles Jeudi. And I saw how he reacted, how he participated, not only in issues that concerns LGBTIQ persons, but he participated in any issue that matters to people in general in country. And that is an inspiration. Not only LGBTIQ person get engaged because of that, but also other people from other institutions that are also advocate for other issues get involved in the issues of LGBTIQ persons because of his attitude, of his way to get engaged to all situations that really calls for help from activists from around the world.
Thanks, Dominique. Azza, do you have anything to add with regard to that question? How do activists in Sudan stay motivated, and how do you get people involved and not just have a situation where people are just trying to stay afloat?
Yeah, so I mean, I just wanted to start by saying that it's not necessary for every LGBTQI community member to become an activist or part of the organization, but I think it's necessarily for the queer and trans organizations in Sudan to follow a participatory approach to bring everybody in. They could work in projects and programs that allow volunteers to be part of their activities, and the most importantly is to share their work with other people. I know that the LGBTQI organization in Sudan have done a lot of events bringing people in just to discuss some of their future work plans or some of the projects and get their feedback. And I think also the most important part is when we give the sense of a unity of purpose, because for the LGBTQI community members currently in Sudan, they are not only united around advocating for their rights or protection, but they also united in one towards one goal, is to free the country from the military dictatorship and to bring democracy back. And I think also the work that has been done by the activists or community members so far is to join the efforts of protesters who are in the streets and resistant communities in different neighborhoods and so on, to say that we are against the military coup, and we are against even the civilians who are supporting this coup, and calling for international community and allies not to support the idea of just we need this Sudan to be stable again in the price of freedoms and rights, and call for everybody to support actually taking the military out of the picture, because this is the only way we can ensure human rights and LGBTQ rights in the country. Thank you.
Asa, thank you so much for that. There's a question that is kind of along similar lines. And this question is from Dean Matias Razi Reno in the Philippines, who says that in the Philippines, our current president is a militant fascist that has supported extrajudicial killings of marginalized citizens for the last 6 years. Now, with the upcoming elections, the son of a dictator that took over the country for decades through martial law is running for president. With that being said, how do you stay strong for what you fight for in such terrible political climates? Milos, I wondered if I could go back to you on this one. Do you feel that despite the terrible political climate, there's something that keeps you going as an activist?
The thing that keeps me going is Lambda Warsaw is mainly focused on psychological help. So we can see sometimes even short time effects of people who come to us, who seek help. They receive this help from our therapists, psychologists, through our meeting groups. For me, for example, leading except of doing all those things, you know, to keeping the psychological support alive, I am focused also on bi activism. Which is a different story, and I cannot answer this question in less than half an hour, so I won't even start, but I'm working for those people who are excluded among the excluded ones already. So, you know, we have the LGBTQIAP community, and then we have those spectrum orientations such as bisexuals, asexuals, aromantic, and so on, and they are being discriminated very often by gays and lesbians within the community. So I'm working inside the box, which is inside the other box, and I meet bi people. I am a leader of the group in Warsaw. There are only 2 groups for bi people in Poland, and you know, getting the power through the group and from the group, from the people who join the group, this is something that keeps me motivated. When it comes to the governmental situation, it's rather demotivating because it's getting worse and worse. And yeah, this is what I can say when it comes to your question. Little activism within the community, for example, 1 or 2 letters from the whole acronym. This is, for me, it's very important.
Yeah, there's always something to do, right? There's always some little successes that are within reach, even if the big picture is very daunting. Dominique, did you want to say something on that question?
Yes, I really appreciate the last speaker, what he says about the fact that we get motivated by doing little action inside of the box. But one of the things that I would like to say is show appreciation, not only within country, but like institution like Outright or EK, they have made so much for activists like us, because so far you're not being acknowledged in your own country. You are doing a lot of work with little means. And sometimes it's the recognition of institution like you that really motivate some people like me or activists around the world.
Thanks, Dominique. Aza.
Just quickly to add, this question is very interesting, and I think, I mean, for me personally, what keeps me motivated, if I can share two things, I think I do bring the human side to my activism. I don't treat my activism as work or as a career. I always engage with the community members in the basis that we are one big family and we have to fight together. I think that's very important because this is make you connected to the issues that you're fighting for, and you think about it as if it's your personal purpose in life. I think I always tell people that I think of my activism in terms of, if someone started doing this in Sudan 50 or 100 years ago, I wouldn't be in the situation that we all are right now. And the second thing, I think also engaging with and sharing experience with activists in a regional level and international level. You know, in the African continent, in the Middle East, North Africa, we get to see each other. I mean, not as often because of the pandemic, we still do it online and so on. But I think the sharing the experience of how we fight and get inspired by people who are working in environments even harder and harsher than the situation in Sudan always keep me motivated and have hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Asa. That's really encouraging. It's good to hear these words of hope when we're talking about such a difficult subject like LGBTIQ lives in crisis. Lester, I wanted to put the question to you in a slightly different way because, you know, obviously you're not from the Afghan queer community, but I just wondered, yourself as an activist, an advocate, and reporter, you have worked in such difficult circumstances over the years. And I wonder what keeps you going to continue doing that. And I will also ask you an alternative question. You can answer one or both, which is that I know that through the course of your research in Afghanistan, you've come across a few Afghan LGBTIQ people who are really trying to do something given the difficult circumstances, even if that's to help others or to connect people to you. You have worked with translators, you've worked with people who've been reaching out to other Afghans to get them to tell their stories. What keeps them motivated? Why are they not just focusing on their own personal safety and keeping their head down?
So you know, it's funny. I've only been at Outright for a couple months, and I still don't really think of myself as an activist. So I'll answer as a reporter and as a researcher. You know, I actually I'll start at a relatively depressing place and maybe go from there, which is that I don't do most of my work with the expectation that it's going to make anything better. I've just worked on too many crises in too many places where just because you're telling the story doesn't lead to change. What I do believe is that one thing that a reporter or a storyteller can help people with is sometimes for people who are dealing with impossible situations or impossible traumas, giving them the respect of listening to their stories, helping those stories be told more broadly, helps them provide some meaning to their situation, helps accord value to their situation. And it's a tiny thing, but I think it's a real thing that is an act of giving humanity back to people who've had humanity taken away from them. And that, even when it's incredibly painful and doesn't lead to material changes in their circumstances, is a small thing that I as an individual can do. And in cases where telling those stories do change the political context, that does mobilize for change, or, you know, just in specific cases, mobilize the support for an individual that then is able to get them into a better situation, that's great. But if I went into those interactions with the expectation that was going to happen, I think that this would be incredibly demoralizing. To your second question, there are a number of Afghan activists who are outside of the country who have done tremendous work interacting with people who are inside the country and sort of getting the word out. I know in some cases, I mean, at least for some people who have recently gotten out that have helped me as translators and such, that I think there is a component that it's been helpful in their own process of coming to terms what's happened to their lives to be able to help others. I always worry about people being re-traumatized in that process, but at least in cases where I've discussed that directly with people, that's what they've told me. I do think that there's a challenge. I think there are some cases where activists have taken on too much in terms of trying to directly engage with governments or providing support for the people who are being contacted without, necessarily legal or psychological training for that kind of work, or just the time and capacity for it. And I think there's a good deal of discussion that still can be had about ways that international organizations can more productively support them to help strategically where that's possible, and in the kinds of things that take sort of technical competencies to do.
Thanks, Lester. And there's one more question in the chat, so I'm going to go to that one. We may still have time for another question or two if anybody has them. This is the last 10 minutes of the panel, so this is your time to get in your question. And of course, I want to mention that on the Feedloop platform, you can continue to interact with the panelists. So you can find them and message them directly and follow up with people with other questions that you may have. But the next question that we have in the chat is from Jacqueline Salsinger. And she says, thank you everyone for sharing your remarks. I'm sorry, they say, I don't want to presume gender. Thank you everyone for sharing your remarks. I wonder if panelists could reflect on the role of LGBTQ diasporas for their respective contexts. How do LGBTQ people of the same nationalities but living elsewhere, perhaps in more stable situations in many cases, participate in providing support, security, and advocacy for LGBTQ communities in their countries of origin? So I'm going to open that up to any of the panelists who have worked with diaspora communities for their thoughts.
I can jump on that question.
Thanks, Asa.
Yeah, so I mean, I always think of myself as someone who has one foot in the diaspora and one foot in the, on the ground, because this was the nature of my work. I'm often traveling to countries where I do work. I'm often have visits to the activists I work with, because before joining an Outright, I was one of the activists and the leaders who were leading the LGBTQI movement in Sudan. And I think in the work that we're doing in Outright with the LGBTQI organizations in Sudan, we started working on a long-term project that started this year. And one of the main pillars of this project is to engage the activists and the community member in the diaspora. The idea is to have regular meetings, online meetings, to bring their perspective, but also to give them the sense of belonging to the community and make a use of their experience and use of their connections and things that they can do outside of the country in their own context that activists inside cannot do. One thing that's very important to highlight here is, and I'm not saying this is the case of everybody, I mean, activists who are living in the diaspora, some of them still face some security issues, some of them still, underground and invisible because of the fear of their life or societal problems with their family and so on. But in most cases, people have a degree of safety and security that is not provided for the people working on the ground. I remember when I was living a few years ago in Egypt, I had to make sure that I had an application, I had a software in my phone that hide all my applications all the time. I have to regularly delete the chat on my WhatsApp and make sure that the people I'm communicating with using safe communication channels like Signal, for example. I've always prepared myself that I can be stopped on the check points, even for non-LGBTQI reasons. And that kind of context make it sometimes very hard to think out of the box, which is something that the activists who are working or living in diaspora might have. So I really think engaging activists in the diaspora is a very important component actually for the LGBTQI movement in Sudan. Thank you.
Thanks, Asa. It's so important to have people like you within the movement who are sharing those tools and creating that kind of transfer of knowledge. Dominique, I wondered if you had anything to say about the role of trans Haitians who are in the diaspora. You mentioned that a number of people have left the country. Do they stay in touch? Do they stay connected to the movement or provide support or advocacy in other ways?
So far, I can say that that has not happened. Most people that leave the country that were activists before, they try to get in touch, but it's not easy. Why? Because I think within the community here in Haiti, we are very, I can't really find the word, but we are suspicious of anything that is coming from the exterior, especially if it was people that were inside and that leave. I think that somehow most of us feel betrayed when they leave. But it is something that we are trying to change, and that's why we are really trying to get allies within the community that were in the community but that have left the country, and they are trying to get back. And it is very important because, as you said before, they have a lot of things to share with us, and they can provide some contact that we can't. And I think it is important. We are now just trying to see that, but before it was not like that.
Thanks so much, Dominique. I wondered if any of the other panelists want to respond to the question about diaspora. I'm sorry, I just realized I was muted. Sorry, classic Zoom problem. The last question in the chat is, can donations be made to outright to support work in a particular country or region? Yes, they can. And I am actually wondering if any of my colleagues from development can respond in the chat. I know there's a couple people on the call who might be able to respond in the chat and let people know who they can get in touch with to support our work in a particular country or region. And of course, we absolutely welcome any kind of support that you can give to Outright. We probably have time for one last question if there is one. So I'm just going to wait 1 moment to see if anybody's feeling shy and wants to give me a last minute question. Okay, well, if not, then on that note, thank you so much to everybody who has attended the plenary. I think that this has been a really fulfilling and in some ways energizing discussion, even though these are extremely difficult topics that we're discussing. It's so important that we put our heads together, that we connect with each other across borders, and that we help each other to stay engaged and motivated and to reach our communities in difficult circumstances. Thank you so much to our panelists, Aza, Milos, Lester, Dominique,